We truly know so much less than we think we do. But let us know this much. We are not alone. In our joy, in our loss, in our quiet, daily, blessed, ordinary moments, we are not alone. A small truth, maybe, in a vast and rapid world. But let us hold that truth as we hold the joys and the sorrows and the moments shared in this space we make holy. Amen, and blessed be.
Our first reading is from the Sufi mystic poet Hafiz. Now is the time to know that all that you do is sacred. Now, why not consider a lasting truce with yourself and God? Now is the time to understand that all your ideas of right and wrong were just a child's training wheels to be laid aside. When you finally live with veracity and love. And before our second reading, I will say it contains some challenging names for me, so we'll do the best we can. But the second reading is from Reverend Clarence Skinner's 1915 book, The Social Implications of Universalism. Jesus's was a soul-stirring message of mighty social import. But when this fresh, invigorating, life-giving stream of Christianity poured out over the Greeks, it was diverted to the philosophically minded. The all-absorbing question became the relation of Jesus' personality to the triune Godhead. It is for this reason that 315 years after the prophet of Nazareth was born, the Christian church was wrangling over Anthonyism, nope, we'll go with that, and Arminianism. For 1,600 years, the theologians have continued to wage battle over the person of Christ, and the world has consequently been blinded to his program.
Picture this. It's the Roman Empire. There you are. It's around 320, the year, not the time. And there you are in the streets of Alexandria, which is one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire at the time. Now, let's say, for these purposes, you are a bishop of the Christian church, which is still fairly new. It is, though, finally safe to be Christian in the Roman Empire. In the last few years, the emperors of both the West and the East have issued edicts of toleration legalizing Christianity. The emperor in the West, Constantine, even converted to Christianity, although some wonder if that was just political pragmatism on his part. Now, you're on the way to the market to pick up, well, I don't know, whatever qualified as groceries in the Roman Empire in the year 320. Based on the Little Caesars ads, I guess pizza. You walk past people, you hear some of them humming the snatch of a tune, whistling it even. You catch a few words. You recognize the tune. Everybody in Alexandria recognizes this damn tune. You catch the lyrics. He was not. From the lips of some young woman. You grind your teeth. You roll your eyes. You don't need to hear the rest of this. You wait at the merchant's stall to hand over some coins for your evening's vegetables, and you overhear the merchant and a couple of customers arguing. Of course he wasn't always there. Only God was always there, the merchant is saying, almost yelling. He sees you, notices your vestments, quiets down, but still manages to sneer at you a little. This was the Arian controversy. A-R-I-A-N, not A-R-Y-A-N, which was an entirely different controversy. A debate, a fight even over the nature of God and Christ and salvation that played out not only in the theological debates of the halls of churches or monasteries, but not just between clergy and bishops, but on the streets, especially on the streets of Alexandria. You might even call it the very first Unitarian, small u, controversy. I'm not convinced that would be entirely accurate, but this Arian controversy helped cement the idea of the Trinity as a core principle of Christian doctrine, and it was the questioning of that doctrine that centuries later sparked the movements that became us, Unitarianism and Universalism. So what was this big deal, this huge controversy? Well, it's way more complicated than I'm going to get into here this morning. But in a sense, it really came down to being a contest between Arius, a priest in the city of Alexandria, and his bosses, the bishops of Alexandria. First, Alexander of Alexandria, which gets a little confusing, and then his successor, Athanasius. And what were they fighting about? Well, in one corner, we have Arius. Now, no modern scholars really think he was all that original of a thinker, so we shouldn't assume he came up with any of these ideas. What he was good at was messaging. And the message he taught was this. Yes, Christ is divine. Christ is not God. The Father created the Son, he taught, meaning that there was a time when Christ, the Son, did not exist, when he, as the quote went, was not. For Arians, this was important because monotheism was important. It was really important to them that Christian teaching preserved the idea that the Hebrew God was the one God. And making Christ also an eternal God, along with the Father, sounded like pandering to Roman polytheism to them. Here's the thing. For the people on the other side, those bishops, having one God was also important. And they thought the idea that God could create another God sounded like Roman polytheism. Now, since I'm talking to a bunch of Unitarians, I do want to point out this wasn't really a fight over the Trinity. Just what the Trinity looked like. Everybody thought there was a Trinity. But Arius and the people who thought like him thought, yeah, it's a Trinity, but God's at the top of the triangle. Christ is in there, still divine, still more godly than us, which, to be fair, is a low bar, but less godly than God. But for the other side, God, Christ, Father and Son had to be equal, had to be co-eternal. They had to have always been. And if all of this sounds really academic and esoteric and like something I might have written a paper about for seminary, you're not wrong. And if it seems boring, I'm with you. Sort of. I kind of geek out on it. But that's me. I have problems. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind about why this became a controversy. And the first of those is salvation. Not really our thing, but it was for early Christians and still is. And both sides were convinced that their explanation of how Christ was or is divine explained salvation. For Athanasius and Alexander, those bishops, salvation was very much tied to the cross and to Jesus' death on it. Salvation worked because God took on human form, took on the corrupting sin that is part of our form. And when he died on the cross, that sin was killed too. Athanasius was convinced that that whole thing only worked if it was truly and fully God on that cross. Anything less, and the trade-off could not be complete. The crucifixion was, a thing to the Arians, but it was less of a deal. They focused on Christ as a connector between an unknowable God and creation, us. For most Arians, Christ offered salvation by empowering the divinity already in our souls. And he did that by serving as a model of virtue in life and in death, and as a teacher of God's truth. So that's the first thing you need to remember about how it became a controversy. The second thing you need to remember is nobody had Netflix or Instagram, or even books. So this may not be fascinating to us, but their idea of a viral video was word of mouth. Pop culture spread by one person to another. And Arius was good at that. He was a poet, and he wrote songs, and his verse and his songs caught on. People repeated them, sang them in the streets of Alexandria. Apparently the line, "There was when he was not," was quite catchy. I believe the tune went something like, "There was when he was not, doo-da, doo-da." All the recordings have been lost. I'm not certain. So that scene I tried to paint at the beginning here wasn't entirely theoretical. I mean, one bishop wrote that he couldn't go to the barbers without having a debate break out over the nature of Christ. At least one bishop was hung. This was a thing. And it was a thing that got the emperor's attention. Constantine the Great, who I assume named himself, wanted the church to be unified so that it could serve his empire. And all this bickering over whether Christ was or was not was messing with his plans. So he called a council of bishops to get it worked out. This is the Council of Nicaea, and it lasted for weeks in the spring and summer of 325. And it went badly for Arius and his supporters. All but a dozen of the assembled bishops voted for a proclamation of faith that said Father and Son are co-equal, rejected the idea that the Son was created by the Father. But just to make sure Arius knew he lost, they took it a step further and ended the proclamation by saying, "Those who say there was when he was not, these the Catholic Church anathematizes." It's a pretty fancy word for condemns. And being anathema, generally regarded not good. Arius, several of his supporters were exiled, but it got messy after that. Some of them got to come back. Arius was put back in his clergy. A bishop got to get his seat back. Several of the emperors after Constantine were Arian. So for decades, it wasn't really clear who won. That all ended in 381 when a new emperor who opposed Arian thought called another council that ruled, again, that Arians were wrong. That Christians believe in the Trinity. The Trinity means the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all equal, one essence. That's it. Done. Matter is settled. Good. Mostly. For a while. But here's the thing about ideas. They are really hard to get rid of. So almost 1,200 years later, a guy you all have probably heard of, Michael Servetus, comes along. And he takes a close look at the Bible and thinks, hey, this Trinity thing, it's not really in the Bible. So maybe Christians should stop killing Jews and Muslims over it. Huh? That went over great, and it got him convicted by both the Catholic Church and the Reformed Church, and burned at the stake with all of his books. But that execution fueled debate across Europe over the nature of the Trinity, and had lots of people wondering, well, how much does this Trinity thing matter? Unitarian ideas spread across Europe and then into England and eventually to America, where our preachers were sometimes condemned by other preachers who noticed that our preachers sort of never talked about the Trinity. And when they condemned them, they called them Arians. So eventually we just said, fine, yeah, we're Unitarians. Live with it. So Arianism as an idea never really died, because ideas seldom do. But this Arian controversy is, I realize, literally ancient history. So why am I talking to you about it in the year of our Lord, 2023? Does it still matter to Unitarian Universalists? Is this history still relevant to a religious movement that gives little thought to the question of Trinity, where most of us don't even believe in God, and those who do aren't that concerned with the Trinity? No, I don't think so. Good night. No. Yeah, of course it's relevant. At least I think so. If nothing else, it's relevant because it is a part of the reason our faith even exists. When the Council of Nicaea decided Arius was wrong and declared his understanding of God to be anathema, it decided that a bunch of human bishops had the power to decide what God is and what God is not. That's got some chutzpah to it. They decided God is three and that salvation is tied to suffering. That theology of suffering has softened for many Christians, but for centuries that is something the church held to, clung to its rightness with ferocity and violence and oppression. Unitarianism and Universalism both grew up out of reactions against those ideas. But if the early church had looked at Arius and said, yeah, we think you're wrong, but hey, it's God. Kind of beyond all of us, right? So what are you going to do? Catchy tune, by the way. And then just moved on, there wouldn't have been anything for our forebears to react against. This faith, as we know it, would not exist. But that isn't what happened. And there are lessons we can still learn from what did happen. Rebecca Ann Parker and Rita Nakashima Brock wrote their book, Saving Paradise, when they realized that somewhere in its history, the Christian church turned away from a message of building communities of love and faith modeled on Jesus' life and teaching, what today we might call the beloved community. Turned away from that to become a church that filtered its faith through the story of the death and suffering on that cross. Now, they don't quite say this, but I think this Arian controversy was a pretty important moment in that path to the cross. And I don't think that's what Arius or Athanasius or Alexander or any of them had in mind at the time. They all had ideas about God and Christ and divinity, and being humans, they wanted to be right. But they weren't talking about suffering and condemnation in the way that it was developed later. They were, you should assume, sincere. This is not about a church trying to flex its muscle. In the 4th century, the church didn't have that much muscle to flex. It's like the little skinny kids in the back of the comic books when I was a kid at the beach needing to buff up. It had very little power. It had a council at Nicaea because an emperor told them they were going to have a council at Nicaea. They were just people trying to figure out what their still fairly new faith meant. And when they came up with an answer, being people, they got very invested in the idea of their answer being right. Or, perhaps more importantly, invested in the idea of their answer being seen as being right. From the place where we are right, the poet warns, flowers will never grow. See, clever ideas and well-reasoned explanations for the divine are all well and good, up to a point. They make for fascinating reading for a seminarian, I guess. But they are not the point. They are, as Hafiz wrote, just a child's training wheels to be laid aside when you finally live with veracity and love. And it seems to me that one lesson to be learned by us, to be learned from the Arian controversy, is just how easy it can be to get so fixated on constructing the perfect training wheels that we forget that what it was we were training for in the first place. In the 1958 report of the American Unitarian Association's Commission on Appraisal, the authors, probably mostly James Luther Adams, warned that disputes over vocabulary and practices can distract a faith from the work of having an effective bearing on the problems of human society. Faith should matter to the world, to the people who live in it. Or as Reverend Skinner put it in this morning's reading, beginning with the Arian controversy, the church fathers got so philosophically minded about defining the way Christ's divinity functioned that they forgot about why it was there in the first place. And we shouldn't let ourselves think that that can't happen to us just because we, as UUs, don't care about the Trinity. The lesson of the Arian controversy, to me, has very little to do with the Trinity itself. Christians might disagree with me. I don't think it has that much even to do with Jesus. It has everything to do with letting our own cleverness, our own thoughtful analysis distract us from the fundamental question of what faith is for, of why church. We aren't immune from the same mistakes the Christian church made just because we keep saying that, hey, we don't have a doctrine. We don't have a creed. Because sometimes I wonder if being creedless is the thing we let ourselves get way too clever about. Does that become our training wheels? Now, I'm not saying we should go out and try to come up with a creed that defines UU beliefs. I don't want to be at that meeting. That meeting would be a nightmare. I am saying that being creedless is not enough of an answer to why church. I am saying that Unitarian Universalism, like Christianity in the 4th century, is a pretty young faith. We're still trying to figure out what that faith is. We are revisiting the core statement of our faith in our bylaws in Article 2 because we are asking ourselves, what does this mean? And that's a good sign. We are trying to understand, to figure out together what this faith we share is, how it fits into the world, what role it has to play, not only in our own individual lives, but in the way we live those lives in the world to bring about a more flourishing world. And I hope that we will always be trying to figure it out. That is the lesson I want us to take from the Arian controversy. I hope that we will craft answers along the way. And I hope they are good answers. And I hope and pray that we never let ourselves become so convinced that they are the right answers that when it comes time to let them go, we can't let them go. Amen.